The wind swept across the Wyoming plains with a loneliness that matched the emptiness in Jacob Turner's heart. It had been 2 years since cholera had taken his wife Mary and their infant son during the brutal winter of 1882. 2 years of waking up to silence, of cooking meals for one, of watching the sunset alone from the porch of his ranch house. At 35 years old, Jacob had built a successful cattle ranch through years of backbreaking work, but success meant nothing when there was no one to share it with. His neighbors, the few families scattered across the vast territory, had been encouraging him to find a new wife. A ranch needed a woman's touch, they said. A man needed companionship. But how does one replace a love that had grown from childhood sweethearts to devoted partners? Mary had been everything to him, and the thought of bringing another woman into the home they had built together felt like a betrayal. It was old Henry Peterson, the postal clerk in the nearest town of Redemption Springs, who first suggested the idea of a mail-order bride. Henry showed Jacob advertisements in newspapers from back east, letters from women seeking husbands in the frontier territories. These were respectable women, Henry assured him, daughters of good families who had fallen on hard times, widows seeking fresh starts, women who simply outnumbered the available men in the crowded cities. It wasn't unusual anymore. Many of the ranchers and miners in the territory had found wives this way. After months of Henry's gentle persuasion and his own gnawing loneliness, Jacob finally agreed to place an advertisement. He described himself honestly, a widowed rancher, 35 years old, owner of 200 acres of grazing land and a herd of cattle, seeking a hard-working woman to share his life. He mentioned that he valued kindness and resilience over beauty, that he needed a partner who understood the harsh realities of frontier life. He received 3 responses, but one stood out. The letter came from a Mrs. Catherine Whitmore in Boston, written in elegant script on fine paper. She described herself as a widow of 28, childless, educated, and eager to start a new life in the West. She wrote about her late husband, a merchant who had died of tuberculosis, leaving her with nothing but debts. Her family had disowned her for marrying beneath her station, and she had no prospects in Boston. She wrote with such honesty and dignity that Jacob found himself reading her letter multiple times, trying to imagine the woman behind the words. They exchanged several more letters over the following months. Catherine wrote about her love of reading, her practical skills in managing a household, her willingness to learn ranching. Jacob wrote about his land, his cattle, his daily routines, and carefully, cautiously, about Mary and the son he had lost. Catherine's response to that revelation had touched him deeply. She wrote that she understood grief, that she didn't expect him to forget his first wife, only to allow room for new memories alongside the old ones. By spring, they had agreed to marry. Jacob sent Catherine money for the train journey from Boston to Cheyenne, with instructions to send a telegram when she arrived so he could meet her. He spent weeks preparing the ranch house, fixing the shutters Mary had always complained about, painting the bedroom, buying new linens and curtains. His hands remembered the work, but his heart raced with anxiety and anticipation. What if they didn't suit each other in person? What if he couldn't love again? What if this was all a terrible mistake? The telegram arrived on a Tuesday in late May. It simply read, "Arriving Cheyenne Friday afternoon train. Catherine." Jacob spent 3 days in an agony of preparation, bathing, trimming his beard, putting on his best suit that still smelled of mothballs. He hitched up his wagon and made the 40-mile journey to Cheyenne, arriving at the train station an hour early. He paced the platform, rehearsing what he would say, clutching a bunch of wildflowers he'd picked along the way. When the train finally pulled into the station with a great hiss of steam and screech of brakes, Jacob's heart hammered in his chest. He watched passengers disembark, scanning for a woman traveling alone, looking for someone who might be searching for him. He saw families reuniting, businessmen with their cases, cowboys heading to the saloons. But no woman traveling alone. No one who looked like they might be his mail-order bride. The platform was nearly empty when he noticed her. A small figure in a pale green silk dress unlike anything he'd ever seen, embroidered with delicate flowers and birds. She wore her black hair in an elaborate style he didn't recognize, and when she turned, Jacob's breath caught. She was Chinese. Young, perhaps 20 at most, with a face of such delicate beauty it seemed out of place in the rough frontier town. She was looking around with wide, frightened eyes, clutching a small cloth bundle and a piece of paper. Jacob approached cautiously, assuming she was lost. But when he got close enough to see the paper in her hand, his world tilted. It was his letter, the one he'd sent to Catherine Whitmore with instructions on how to find him. The young woman saw him looking and held out the paper with trembling hands. She pointed to his name written there, then to him, then to herself, and said something in a language he didn't understand. Confusion gave way to shock, then to a cold anger. This had to be some kind of mistake, or worse, a cruel trick. He looked around for Catherine Whitmore, thinking perhaps this Chinese girl was a servant or traveling companion. But there was no one else. The girl seemed to understand his confusion. She reached into her bundle and pulled out the letters, his letters, the ones he'd sent to Catherine Whitmore. She held them out to him with both hands, and he saw tears beginning to form in her dark eyes. Jacob took the letters with shaking hands and found one he hadn't written, addressed to him. The handwriting was different from Catherine's elegant script. He opened it with a growing sense of dread and read words that made his blood run cold. It was from a Mrs. Dorothy Chen in San Francisco. She explained that her daughter, Mei Lin, had been purchased from a merchant ship by a woman named Catherine Whitmore who ran a boarding house. Catherine had treated Mei Lin as little more than a slave, working her mercilessly. When Catherine received Jacob's letter and money, she had seen an opportunity. She had corresponded with Jacob using Mei Lin to copy the letters in English, teaching her what to write. Then, when it was time to travel west, Catherine had sent Mei Lin in her place, pocketing Jacob's money for herself and ridding herself of an unwanted servant. Mrs. Chen wrote that she had learned of this scheme through another Chinese woman who worked at the boarding house. By the time she tracked down her daughter, Mei Lin was already on the train west. All Mrs. Chen could do was give her daughter this letter to present to Jacob, begging him not to turn Mei Lin away, explaining that sending her back would mean returning her to slavery or worse. The letter included details about Mei Lin that proved its authenticity, and at the bottom, in careful childish English letters, Mei Lin had written, "I work hard. Please mercy." Jacob stood on that platform, wildflowers crushed in one hand, letter in the other, looking at this terrified Chinese girl who had been sent to him like a package to the wrong address. Around them, people were starting to stare. A Chinese woman in Cheyenne was unusual enough, but one standing with a white rancher was drawing hostile looks and muttered comments. Jacob saw a group of men beginning to gather, their intentions clearly unfriendly. He made a decision in that moment that would change both their lives. He couldn't send her back to slavery. He couldn't leave her here to face whatever cruelty this frontier town might inflict on a lone Chinese woman. His mother had taught him that you judged people by their character, not their origin, and his father had taught him that a man protected those weaker than himself. Whether this girl would become his wife or simply someone he helped was a question for later. Right now, she needed protection. Jacob picked up her small bundle and gestured to his wagon. "Come," he said gently, making his intention clear through gesture rather than words she couldn't understand. Mei Lin hesitated, clearly terrified but seeing no alternative. She followed him to the wagon, and he helped her up onto the seat, noticing how light she was, how small her hands were. As they pulled away from the station, Jacob saw the relief in her eyes mixed with continued fear, and he wondered what on earth he was going to do. The 40-mile journey back to the ranch was conducted in almost complete silence. Jacob tried a few times to communicate, pointing to things and saying their names, but Mei Lin just nodded nervously, clearly not understanding. He learned her name by pointing to himself and saying, "Jacob," until she understood, then pointing to her. She said something that sounded like, "Mei Lin," and he nodded, filing it away. Mei Lin. A pretty name, though he had no idea what it meant. As they approached the ranch in the fading light of evening, Jacob tried to see it through her eyes. The simple wooden house with its covered porch, the barn and outbuildings, the corral with horses, the vast emptiness stretching in every direction. It must have looked like the end of the world to someone from a city. Mei Lin's face showed no emotion, but he saw her hands gripping the edge of the seat as if preparing for whatever came next. Inside the house, Jacob lit the lamps and showed Mei Lin the spare bedroom he'd prepared for Catherine. She looked around the simple room with its clean bed, washstand, and window with new curtains, and something in her expression shifted. She turned to Jacob and spoke rapidly in Chinese, tears streaming down her face. Though he couldn't understand the words, He understood she was thanking him. She had expected something terrible, and instead, he was offering her a clean room of her own. Over the following days and weeks, Jacob and Mei Lin developed a strange but workable routine. He showed her the kitchen, the garden, the chickens, the well, all the practical aspects of ranch life. She watched everything intently and learned with remarkable speed. Though they couldn't speak to each other, they communicated through gestures, demonstrations, and gradually, a handful of shared words. Jacob would point to objects and say their English names. Mei Lin would repeat them carefully, her pronunciation improving each time. What surprised Jacob was how hard-working Mei Lin proved to be. She rose before dawn, just as he did. She learned to collect eggs, feed the chickens, tend the garden, cook simple meals. Her cooking was different from anything he'd tasted, using methods and seasonings he didn't recognize, but it was good. More than good. The house, which had felt like an empty shell since Mary's death, slowly began to feel lived in again. But the situation couldn't remain undefined forever. They weren't married, yet she lived in his house. The nearest neighbors were miles away, but eventually word would spread. Jacob knew the kind of assumptions people would make, and worse, the kind of danger that could come to a Chinese woman living alone with a white man on an isolated ranch. The Chinese Exclusion Act had been passed just the year before, and anti-Chinese sentiment ran high throughout the West. It was during the third week of Mei Lin's presence on the ranch that everything came to a head. Jacob had gone to Redemption Springs for supplies, and when he returned, he found Mei Lin in tears, barricaded in her room. Through gestures and her limited English, he understood that 3 men had come to the ranch while he was gone. They had tried to force their way into the house, shouting slurs and threats. Mei Lin had managed to lock herself in her room, and they had eventually left, but not before breaking several windows and threatening to return. Jacob felt a fury unlike anything he'd experienced since Mary's death. This innocent girl had been sent to him through no choice of her own, and now she was in danger because he had chosen to protect her. He couldn't send her away, knowing what awaited her. But he couldn't protect her properly unless their situation was legitimate in the eyes of the law and the community. That night, sitting at the kitchen table with Mei Lin, Jacob tried to explain using the few words they shared and lots of gestures. They needed to marry, really marry, to protect her. It wouldn't be like a real marriage, he tried to convey. She would have her own room, her own space, her own life. But the law would protect her as his wife in a way it wouldn't protect her as merely a girl living in his house. Mei Lin listened carefully, her intelligent eyes following his gestures and understanding more than he expected. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she spoke in Chinese, a long speech that he couldn't understand but that seemed important. At the end, she took his hand and placed it on her heart, then on his heart, and said one of the few English words she'd learned, trust. The next day, they rode into Redemption Springs together, Jacob's rifle prominently displayed across his lap. He went straight to the church and found Reverend Matthews, a fair-minded man who had known Jacob since he'd first come to Wyoming. Jacob explained the situation honestly, showing him Mrs. Chen's letter, explaining how Mei Lin had been deceived and sent to him, and how she now needed the protection that marriage would provide. Reverend Matthews was skeptical at first, concerned about the language barrier and the circumstances. But he saw the determination in Jacob's eyes and the quiet dignity in Mei Lin's bearing despite her obvious fear. He also knew, as Jacob did, that refusing to help would likely condemn this young woman to a terrible fate. After a long conversation, he agreed to perform the ceremony. The wedding was simple and strange. Mei Lin wore her green silk dress, now carefully mended where it had torn during her journey. Jacob wore his Sunday suit. There were no guests except for Henry Peterson, who served as witness and whose eyes were suspiciously bright throughout the ceremony. When Reverend Matthews asked if they took each other as husband and wife, Jacob said yes clearly. Mei Lin, who had been taught this one word for this moment, said yes in her accented English, and it was done. As they left the church, now legally married, Jacob noticed the stares and heard the whispers. Some were shocked, some were disapproving, and some were openly hostile. But they were married now, and that meant something in frontier law. Mei Lin was his wife, under his protection, and anyone who threatened her would have to answer to him. The months that followed were a time of gradual discovery and unexpected connection. Despite the language barrier, or perhaps because of it, Jacob and Mei Lin learned to communicate in deeper ways. They learned each other's rhythms and habits. Jacob discovered that Mei Lin had a beautiful singing voice, and though he couldn't understand the Chinese songs she sang while working in the garden, the melodies moved him. Mei Lin discovered that Jacob was gentle with animals and that he talked to his horses, and somehow this made her feel safer. Jacob began teaching Mei Lin English more systematically, and her quick mind absorbed the language rapidly. As her vocabulary grew, she began to tell him her story. She had been the daughter of a merchant in Canton, educated and cultured. But when her father's business failed, she had been sold to pay his debts, a common practice she explained without bitterness. She had ended up on a ship to America, then in the hands of Catherine Whitmore, who had worked her brutally for nearly a year. In return, Jacob told Mei Lin about Mary, about the son they had lost, about building the ranch from nothing. He half expected jealousy or resentment that he still loved his first wife, but Mei Lin simply said, in her improving English, "Good man love wife. Good man remember." Her acceptance of his grief somehow made it easier to bear. Winter came, harsh and unforgiving as Wyoming winters are. The ranch was often snowed in for days at a time. In the enforced closeness, something began to shift between Jacob and Mei Lin. It started with small things. He noticed how she laughed at his clumsy attempts to use chopsticks when she made Chinese food. She noticed how he always made sure her chair was closest to the fire. They began having actual conversations as her English improved, talking late into the night about everything and nothing. One evening in January, during a particularly fierce blizzard, the fire in the main room blazed while snow piled against the windows. They were playing a simple card game Jacob had taught her, and Mei Lin was laughing at his exaggerated disappointment when she won. In that moment, with her face lit by firelight and her eyes bright with amusement, Jacob felt something he thought had died with Mary. Not the same love, but a new kind of love, unexpected and precious in its own way. Mei Lin must have seen something in his expression because her laughter faded and she looked at him with sudden seriousness. She reached across the table and took his hand. "Jacob," she said carefully, "I am your wife true now? Not just paper." He understood what she was asking, what she was offering. His heart, which he'd thought too broken to love again, swelled with an emotion he couldn't name. "Yes," he said. "If you want that. If you choose that." "I choose," she said simply and squeezed his hand. Their marriage became real that winter, not through grand gestures or passionate declarations, but through the quiet choice to open their hearts to each other. They learned to navigate their cultural differences with patience and humor. Mei Lin taught Jacob about her traditions, her beliefs, her way of seeing the world. Jacob taught her about his own customs and beliefs. They created something new together, a blend of two worlds that belonged uniquely to them. Spring brought new challenges and new joys. Mei Lin announced, in her now fluent English, that she was pregnant. Jacob felt terror and hope in equal measure, remembering the son he'd lost. But Mei Lin was strong and healthy, and when their daughter was born in September, Jacob held her with tears streaming down his face. They named her Hope, because that's what she represented to both of them. The people of Redemption Springs slowly came to accept the unusual couple. Some never did, clinging to their prejudices, but others saw what was obvious to anyone paying attention, that Jacob Turner and his Chinese wife had found something rare and beautiful. They saw how he looked at her, how she looked at him, how they worked together on the ranch with the seamless coordination of true partners. Years later, when their children asked how their parents met, Jacob and Mei Lin would tell the story truthfully. They would explain that they had been brought together by deception and desperation, but had chosen to stay together through love and respect. They would say that sometimes the best things in life come in unexpected packages, that love doesn't always look the way you expect it to, and that courage means opening your heart even when you think it's too broken to love again. Mei Lin would add, in her lilting English that never quite lost its